Nowhere in the pages of history can one find a greater champion of justice. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear.
And I'll tell you something else, too, is I cannot stand sissies.
You're going to talk about wrestling, that's redneck talk.
And guess what, fatso? I'm the world champion.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the 1,000 Hours Podcast from WhenItWasCool.com. This is the podcast all about the pioneer era of pro wrestling, that being pre-1900 pro wrestling. I'm Carl Stern, the host of the Dragon King Carl Classic Wrestling audio show, is heard at WrestlingObserver.com, Figure4Online.com, and my website, which is WhenItWasCool.com, and this podcast is produced and distributed by WhenItWasCool.com. Hope you'll check us out, become a Patreon supporter. This is hour number 77 of 1,000 Hours. This show is sponsored, meaning we only produce episodes of this show when we have a sponsor for it. And this is hour 77, and our sponsor is Eric Darcy from Wrestling with the Dog podcast, himself a great podcast available at When It Was Cool. And he sponsored today's show with a question. So this is actually a focused show. We will be referring to my book, Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus today. We'll be going through a little more of that. But primarily I want to focus on the question that Eric asked. And Eric sponsored this show simply by, number one, becoming a Patreon supporter at When It Was Cool. Of course, Eric's been around as a Patreon for a long time, from the very beginning, quite frankly. And we're very proud to have him there. But you can also sponsor a show if you're already a Patreon supporter, or perhaps you just don't want to, add Patreon to your subscriptions or whatever. You can directly sponsor a show. We have a PayPal and a Cash App link on the front page of When It Was Cool. And it's kind of like a tip jar, anything $10 or more, and we will dedicate an hour of this show to you. And even if you want a specific topic like Eric did, we will do that as well. We've had people give as much as $100 for an hour of the show, and we greatly are appreciative of that because it helps our website run. So Eric asked this question, and it is a great question, and it hits to the core of what this podcast, 1,000 Hours, and my book, The Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, what they're all about. And his question is simply this: Why should we study pre-1900s wrestling and key players and moments? And this is an excellent question. Number one, we have to establish this. This question implies that nobody really has historically taken it seriously to study this era. So is the pioneer pre-1900 wrestling underserved in wrestling discussion, books and podcasts and documentaries and things like that? And I would say the answer is a resounding yes. It is very... How many times before this show and my book came out had you heard about people like William Muldoon and Colonel James H. McLaughlin and Andre Cristal and H.M. Dufer and all these wonderful, very colorful characters? How often had you heard deep dives into their exploits prior to that? A few of you may have, especially if you were searching out that information, but no, it's never been put together in the deep research that I did with the book. I literally went through every available newspaper in America from the 1800s that mentioned the word wrestling or mentioned a prominent wrestling figure. It took me years to do this. In fact, I started back in the 1990s. Yes, this book began in literal the 1900s as I put out the Pioneers of Wrestling special and then built off that. And we're trying to get to the truth of it. If you had heard of the era and you had some interest in the people, then you probably have, like myself, devoured misinformation, stories that weren't true, events that never happened. You may have even heard it was an era of these gritty, strong, powerful shooters who and these very tough men who wrestled in barns in front of a few dozen people betting on them, and they would fight till it was basically early UFC. And even I felt like through most of my lifetime and most of my pro wrestling history research, which back, before the late 1990s, didn't really, there was not much out there on the Pioneer era. A few books, you've probably heard of a few of the books, Fall Guys and things like that. But there wasn't a lot out there, and a lot of it had misinformation that was just repeated over and over and over. And it really wasn't the book I put together, Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus. Really, this book could not have been done until this era, because the research tools just weren't available. Now at newspapers.com, there are millions of newspapers online. That was not the case in the 1990s, where you literally had to go to libraries and search through microfilm and hope you came across, something on the topic you were researching. And in my case, digging through hundreds of newsletters, many of these very independent, very small newsletters, but sometimes with some information packed in there. There was early online resources, different message boards, and different people who were doing kind of a cursory look at things. Of course, there was the great researcher J. Michael Kenyon, who collected lots of newspaper articles and published them online, some dating back to the Pioneer era. And so you gather all these very few fragmented things together, trying to put together a picture of what the Pioneer era was. Then those who came along afterwards, such as Frank Gotch, who then, in wrestling terms, beget people like Earl Caddock and Joe Stecker and Ed Strangler Lewis, and through Ed Strangler Lewis we get Lou Thez, and they would repeat stories about what they had heard. And let's be honest, these were almost certainly biased stories. If I was a friend of this great old timer like Farmer Burns, I probably embellished his stories a little bit. Or if there was someone who I didn't like maybe Evan Strangler Lewis, well, you would diminish his impact as well. In fact, one of the in my opinion, if you made a list of the 100 toughest, real, true toughest guys who would win in a fight in their era of pro wrestlers of all time, and I've read this by other historians too, and got considerable consensus on this, you probably never heard of a guy named John Pesek. And he wasn't a Pioneer era guy. He was a guy from the 1920s, 1930s. But why have I never heard of John Pesek before if he was so great and powerful? Well, it's because Ed Strangler Lewis didn't care for John Pesek. Didn't really like him personally. And so Ed Strangler Lewis, who was the mentor and manager to Lou Thez, who was someone who wrote a book, Hooker, who was online during the latter years of his life, who was passing down these stories, said very little about John Pesek, because where he got his information didn't say a lot about John Pesek. Yet research and stories and investigation reveals that, look, as far as the legit shooters in wrestling history, John Pesek is easily in the top 5 and a strong argument for number 1, and many people have never even heard of him. And that's how wrestling history was done up to really the last few years, where so much more was available. I can go on now, and 2 or 3 people have archived many of the newsletters that have ever been published, including many. Look, everybody knows the Wrestling Observer newsletter by Dave Meltzer, and certainly they should. It has been the Wall Street Journal of Wrestling since the 1980s. Many people know the Pro Wrestling Torch with Wade Keller and the work he's done, but there were so many other smaller, independently published newsletters that were around. There are many people certainly know Figure 4 Online, or Figure 4 newsletter with Brian Alvarez from back in the day. And but there were others, Evan Ginsberg, Wrestling Then and Now, Wrestling Chatterbox, Georgianne Macropolis, and so many others, so many that you've probably never even heard of, even my own Dragon King newsletter. And those are archived. All of those are somewhere online. If you search deep enough, you'll find various copies, sometimes complete collections, and then you have all these millions of newspapers and magazines that are archived, and with search engines like Google, and nowadays with AI, and we're going to talk about AI in a minute. I actually had a conversation just a few minutes ago with ChatGPT about Pioneer Era Wrestling, just to kind of judge where it was at in its knowledge base. And I found out some interesting things, and I think you may discover those as well. But here today, we finally are able to put together a easy-to-understand narrative of what pre-Frank Gotch pro wrestling looked like. And why should we study pre-1900 wrestling? Because if you're listening to the show, you're probably a wrestling fan. You've probably followed some era of pro wrestling in the past. Maybe you're even a fan of the current wrestling product, WWE, AEW, AAA, New Japan, TNA has made kind of a comeback recently. NWA is trying to raise their profile as well. So some of you are fans of that. And this is your favorite era. Some of you have been fans back in the 1980s, the territorial era, as we call it. And that's wonderful. Buy one of my books, please. Others, we've been talking a lot about the early 1990s lately, kind of an underserved era in talking about pro wrestling history as well. So somewhere along the line, you became a wrestling fan. Well, and to many of us, it's been one of the great things in our life. It's been something we've spent a lot of money on, we spent a lot of time on, we spent a lot of mental energy on. We've had our favorites, we've had our least favorites. You've probably watched shoot interviews and documentaries and all this good stuff, and none of it would exist if not the foundation laid in the Pioneer era. Now, you may say, and perhaps even rightfully so, you may argue, well, someone would have come along at some point and started pro wrestling. But I doubt that. I doubt that, because what wrestling is, what is pro wrestling? If you had to put down a human definition to it, not Google up what wrestling, I'm not talking about that, but what is wrestling? Professional wrestling. It is a predetermined, scripted action fight sequence in front of a live audience of fans and spectators, that tells a story. It's a mixture of soap opera and sport. It's a mixture of action movie and drama. That's not something that just develops out of nowhere. It developed from a seed and grew from that seed. And that seed was the Pioneer era. How did sport and entertainment get entangled to begin with? American football has been around since the very late 1800s. Why did it not become worked and scripted? You could make a great, very dramatic football game. The last seconds of the game, and the offensive quarterback throws an interception, and the defensive linebacker or something intercepts it, runs it all the way down the field, and everybody celebrates just as the buzzer sounds, and it's incredible, and all that could be scripted. So why isn't it? College, NFL, football's huge. Basketball, Major League Baseball. Why did entertainment not involve itself in that? And basketball is actually interesting because there is a scripted version of basketball. The Harlem Globetrotters, been around since, forever. Harlem Globetrotters actually started out as a legitimate team, a legitimate basketball team, and then figured out their act. And still to this day, you can see the Harlem Globetrotters doing scripted entertainment basketball. Why is that not the way that regular NBA basketball went? Yet wrestling did. Why? Well, because in the 1800s, wrestling being imported from all over the world, immigrants coming to America, bringing from their place of previous residence, be that Ireland, be that England, be that France. Very important is France in wrestling history. And they bring all these people in, and for sport, just like we talked about with Abraham Lincoln, his famous wrestling match at Offutt's General Store. Was it worked? Was it predetermined? Probably no. Why not? Well, because some of these French immigrants later on introduced their style of wrestling to America, which came from the circus. And it was entertainment, just like the trapeze act, just like the tightrope walkers, fire eaters, the strong men. It was an act that they put on for entertainment. And there was a sinister flip side to it as well, in that some of these very enterprising, tough men back in the 1800s figured out, hey, if we can have a predetermined wrestling match in front of fans who are betting on this match, we can all make money by swinging the betting odds toward one and letting the other one win and then splitting the money. And everybody, well, except for the fans, profits. And so that entertainment, that con, becomes worked into it. The French wrestlers start showing up in mass, after the Civil War with their Greco-Roman style of wrestling, which is not the Greco-Roman that you know from the Olympics or whatever. This was an entertainment style of wrestling. And they were very successful and very profitable at it. And as that becomes mixed and it actually went, the bubble actually went to the point it burst in the 1800s, in that the American public turned against it. Figured out, the newspapers long figured out that this was a fraud. This was fake. They even used those words. They even had their own word for it. We have the word worked today. A worked match is a predetermined match. They had a word for it, hippodroning. Because many of these matches were held in hippodromes, that term became used in the media and by the wrestlers to mean a worked or fake match. The term work itself is derived from the term from a term from back in the 1800s that evolved into meaning the predetermined loser of a wrestling match became a worker, a jobber. It was called a put-up job. And a put-up job meant this is a fake or hippodromed match. It is a predetermined match. And the loser of that match became known as a jobber. That's where these terminologies came from. So wrestling in the 1800s had little to nothing to do with legit combat sports like UFC and MMA and boxing and even collegiate and freestyle wrestling. Had little to do with that, and much more. It was a much closer kin to modern American entertainment style professional wrestling. And that's why we should study it, because literally when people like Cody Rhodes come out and cut a promo, or people like Roman Reigns come out and with their elaborate ring entrances and gear and their whole shtick, how that came about was Pioneer Era Wrestling. Many of the same things you see today. Of course, they had no television then. They had no radio. You went to the local opera house and bought a ticket to a entertainment show, and you might see a comedy skit, you might see a play, you might see a magic show, you might see a strong man or physical culturist act, and you may see some wrestling as well. And that's how wrestling's popularity spread in the United States, whereas there had been this long idea that, it began in the carnivals and the circuses, and they would have these, and the way it got worked was they would have a real tough guy, shooter, in their stable, and he would go out and work against plants in the crowd and build up money and then take on a local yokel, and they'd be betting on that too. And that definitely happened. I mean, that's not made up, but it was not the dominant way that wrestling evolved. It was through the opera houses. It was through these troops or cliques or trusts or companies of wrestlers, just the way it is today. Your Vince McMahon types evolved from the Harry Hill types. They evolved from the Richard K. Fox types. Parson Davies types. These were all, there are archetypes to everything we see today in Pioneer Era Wrestling. And people get hung up on these different eras, and rightfully so. Everybody has kind of a favorite era. I myself personally have always been kind of interested in, the Ed Strangler Lewis Luthez era, John Pesek, that era of wrestlers. But I'd never cared that much about like the Gorgeous George days, the early TV days. Just really didn't interest me that much. But I liked, the 70s, certainly the 1980s, which was the time I myself got introduced to wrestling, the 1990s. And by, 2005 or so, I was pretty much lost a lot of my interest as wrestling evolved in a different direction than I was really interested. Wrestling got too dumb for me with, Katie Vick's skits and just WWF's just constant, vulgarity and stuff. It went in a direction I didn't want it to go. The NWA, WCW had already died a death by that point. So there was nothing left for me that was really interesting. And like many wrestling fans, probably many of you listening to this very show right now, I stuck around for years and years and years hoping I would get whatever it was, hoping it would, quote, get better. But what I really meant was hoping it would give me something entertaining that was entertaining to me. But I figured out, I just I left whatever wrestling gave me. It no longer gave me that, and it never did since. But that doesn't mean I have to give up. There's plenty of great stuff out there. I mean, I could spend hours and hours and hours on YouTube watching some of the favorite stuff I ever saw, and even finding new things I never saw before, and I still get my wrestling fix that way. But by going back to the Pioneer Era, I can learn new things that few, if anybody, ever really knew, and clear up some mysteries. And that's another thing I really have enjoyed is, there were several stories along the way that I understood over the years as being the Pioneer Era. And every time we come to one of those stories, I often find that the reality was very different than the story passed down. And so why study the Pioneer Era pre-1900s wrestlers and the key players? Because it is intrinsically important to understanding how wrestling evolved since then. And here we sit in 2025. Wrestling, of course, looks nothing like it did in 1925, nor 1875, but it grew from the same seed. And many of the things that happened along the way, think right now of your favorite angle you remember. Think back with this thought experiment with me, and your time as a wrestling fan, what's your favorite match or angle? You don't have to compare it to anybody. I don't care how many stars Dave Meltzer did or did not give the match. I don't care if anybody else on earth likes these people or this match. What do you remember? What do you remember that you liked? Well, think about that. And that is owed, its very existence is owed to what was happening back then. And you would be surprised how many times you could find parallels to it. So, as I've spent the first 23 minutes of this show discussing Eric's question, why should we study pre-1900s wrestling, key players and key moments, it is an extremely important question. Now, what I'd like to do right here, we've been going through my book, Dragon King Carl's Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of Wrestling. It's available at Amazon. If you go to whenitwascool.com, you'll see plenty of links there on the front page to order this and my other books. We're about halfway through my book right now. In fact, I'm looking at it on Kindle, and it says 50%. We're 50% through the book. We've just got to the end of, or we're starting November of 1880. So for the next few minutes, I want to go through some more of the book. But when we come back, I've got some, since this episode is primarily, not going through the timeline of the book, I've actually got a couple very interesting emails. The great wrestling researcher and historian Jason Campbell has sent me a couple things from the Pioneer Era that I did not have when I wrote the book. This is new information, and one of them deals with the very interesting and complex character of Oozle Prickett. Remember Oozle Prickett, an early American heavyweight champion, and a guy who ends up working matches in a way that is obviously going to incite a riot, and he does, and he gets in lots of trouble for it, and then he ends up getting murdered for working a match. And Jason has found some new information on him, as well as something else too I want to take a look at. But then I want to talk also about, I just had a conversation with ChatGPT to kind of check up on it. I've done this previously, what it knows about 1800s pro wrestling, more importantly, what it got wrong about it, and how to correct this information, because let's be honest, if the world continues in the direction it's going, it probably won't be here in a couple of years, but let's just say it is, AI is going to be what is going to be thinking for most people. You're going to pick up your phone and you're going to say, hey, AI app of choice, tell me about 1800s pro wrestling, or tell me about William Muldoon, or tell me about Colonel James H. McLaughlin, or who won a match between John McMahon and Colonel James. Okay, that's how people are going to think. And if AI has the wrong information, it's going to produce the wrong answers and continue to perpetuate this myth. Now, or the mythology of that era. Now, this I realize is not the most important thing in the world, but it is important. It is history. And with nobody to document history, then history does not exist. It's lost. And pro wrestling has existed in the United States of America since about the 1830s and continues very much today. It's made billions and billions of dollars, perhaps as much as $1 trillion over its entire existence. If you take every ticket ever bought, I wonder what that would add up to be. And we can only theorize what that might be, but it's been very impactful in the popular culture. We just recently saw the death of Hulk Hogan, and look how much he crossed over in the popular culture. I wrote an article about it, his death at whenitwascool.com, focusing on his pop culture relevance too, his movies, even music, the Rocky III, the whole deal. He was very influential in pop culture. You ask somebody who hates pro wrestling, hates it, would never spend a second of their lives watching it, and you ask them, do you know who Hulk Hogan is? They absolutely will know who he is, and without having ever saw a second of his wrestling matches. That's how ingrained in popular culture he was. So it is important, in my opinion, to know this. Now, I know history isn't everybody's cup of tea, and I get that. It is mine. I enjoy history very much, and so, of course, I'm going to enjoy pro wrestling history. That's why I've done it so much, and I greatly appreciate your following us here. So let me real quick, let's just run through maybe November of 1880, because it contains a very fabulous story about a work from 1880. This doesn't sound like people MMA fighting in a barn. This is Shasterism. Have you ever been, this is really relevant back in the 1990s when I kind of promoted independent wrestling my own self and stuff, and maybe you had this experience yourself. You're out about in your local hometown, you see a wrestling poster, and it says, hey, coming to your local high school gym, it's going to be Sergeant Slaughter versus the Ultimate Warrior. And you think to yourself, wow, Ultimate Warrior coming to Podunkville, Louisiana, to my alma mater. When you get there and it's Dollar General Ultimate Warrior, it's not Ultimate Warrior, it is The Warrior. And he's a guy named Doug from the local gym, and he's got face paint on and tassels tied around his, his formidable but, not steroid engrossed muscles. Perhaps Sergeant Slaughter's really there, but the Ultimate Warrior he's wrestling ain't the guy that was in the Toronto Sky Dome at WrestleMania 6. Okay, different guy. A fraud, a Lance Von Erich. Well, there is a parallel to that in 1880s wrestling. We've already saw Lucien Mark faking his way through being Andre Cristal for a long time, and that is a highly entertaining story. But here's another one for you. November 6, 1880. John McMahon challenges W.J. Farrell in the newspapers. John McMahon says he is the legitimate American collar and elbow champion. He's not. And he has the belt to prove it. He does not. He says both he and Farrell have beaten former champion James Owens and should meet for the championship. So what it's basically is, this is like a Jerry Lawler USWA kind of thing. It's like, I'm the AWA champion, I'm the world-class champion, and regardless of Kerry Von Erich is the world-class champion, we're going to meet and we're going to unify the two belts to see who the real champion is. So that's essentially what he's saying here. Well, there's going to be a twist to this story. The newspapers report that McMahon and Farrell have signed articles of agreement for a match, but the next day, W.J. Farrell, who is a known wrestler from that, this is not just a random name that popped up. There are a few instances throughout the book and research that his name comes up. He was a known top-tier wrestler. But newspapers report that Farrell has said whoever signed those papers was an imposter. I've agreed to no such match. I have no idea what you're talking about. Myself and John McMahon are going to face off for the new American Collar and Elbow Championship. You kidding me? I've not heard of this. So what's going on here? November 13th, 1880, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at the Lyceum Theater, attendance was, quote, a very large crowd. John McMahon defeated W.J. Farrell, a man who had never told the newspaper, I've never heard about this match. Well, anyway, John McMahon beats W.J. Farrell 2 out of 3 falls in collar and elbow for the, quote, American Championship belt, and $1,000. The match lasted 1.5 hours. Well, as I do with all my books, I have Dragon King Carl notes, so that's in bold, so that means there's more to the story. Dragon King Carl note is not so fast. The San Francisco Chronicle says the match must have been a fraud, as W.J. Farrell was in Petaluma, California, not in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's on the other side of the country. W.J. Farrell was in Petaluma, California, working as a blacksmith on the day this match happened. The Petaluma Daily newspaper later confirms that the person John McMahon wrestled was not, in fact, the real W.J. Farrell. The Pittsburgh Post later reveals that the fake W.J. Farrell was actually John F. Kennedy, not the president, but there was a wrestler by that name, often called J.F. or W.F. Kennedy. And he worked with John McMahon frequently. So this was a scam. This was a deal to try to bolster John McMahon's status as not the American heavyweight champion. H.M. Duffer is at this point. And very interesting. November 16th, 1880, Providence, Rhode Island, the Opera House. H.M. Duffer wrestled Duncan C. Ross to a draw in a mixed style match. This match is erroneously reported in some title histories as an American collar and elbow title change from the champion Duncan C. Ross was champion at this point, back to H.M. Duffer, but multiple newspapers clearly call this match a draw. And here is yet another Dragon King Carl note. At this point, despite what many title histories report, the newspapers are calling H.M. Duffer, Duncan C. Ross, and John McMahon all the collar and elbow champion of America almost equally. Ross had won a, quote, championship previously from H.M. Duffer, but in a mixed style match, losing all of the collar and elbow rounds. Thus, it seems many newspapers still considered H.M. Duffer the collar and elbow champion. And finally, for November of 1880, November 29th, 1880, New York City, New York, Lyric Hall, attendance between 800 and 900 people. Greco-Roman rules. Edwin Bibby wrestled Clarence Whistler to a 4-hour draw, and Harry Hill was a referee. So, look, this was probably a hippodrome. Harry Hill, anytime you see his name, you've got to be super skeptical. Edwin Bibby is a big star in England. He's over here touring the United States. And Clarence Whistler is on the rise. He's going to be William Muldoon's biggest opponent. Also worked with Muldoon and also dies at the height of his success. So let's take our mid-show break right now and come back and talk about what Jason Campbell has sent me, along with what ChatGPT thinks about 1800s pro wrestling. And we'll be right back after this. Hey everybody, this is Carl Stern from WhenItWasCool.com. I'm here to tell you about my new book, now available, Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of professional wrestling. Pro wrestling didn't start with Frank Gotch. He didn't just appear out of the void to bring us entertainment-style professional wrestling. No, it was built on a legacy some 70 to 80 years old. That's what I'm going to talk to you about, an era of wrestling in America seldom ever discussed, never before in this detail. I have put 700 pages of information about the pioneers of professional wrestling, like William Muldoon, Colonel James H. McLaughlin, Professor Theobald Bauer, Clarence Whistler, William Miller, and so many more. Maybe some names you've never heard of before, maybe some you've only heard in passing. I will tell you the origins and evolution. Now available, Amazon.com, WhenItWasCool.com. All right, we're back for the second half of the show. Now, again, I want to thank Eric Darcy for sponsoring this hour 77 of the 1,000 Hours. 1,000 Hours, weird name for a show, I know, but if this is the first time you've ever listened to it, one of our great foundational Patreon supporters at When It Was Cool, guy who goes by the name of No Friender, had texted me and said, I could listen to you talk about the pioneers of wrestling for 1,000 hours. And I thought to myself, I could probably talk about the pioneers of wrestling for 1,000 hours. I'm literally writing the book on the era. And so, thus, the name of this show. So if you would, help me spread the word on social media, wherever you go, if you post at Reddit, if you post on message boards, if you ever have the opportunity to encounter someone interested in the Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling, I hope you will recommend my book, Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, my website, WhenItWasCool.com, and this podcast, 1,000 Hours. And thank you very much for doing so. Let's go first over here to Jason Campbell. Is a fantastic wrestling researcher. He has the very coveted Pro Wrestling Title History or Pro Wrestling History domain name, which I've long been envious of. What a great grab that was. Probably worth some money if he ever decides to sell that. I don't have any money, but if I could buy it, I would. But anyway, Jason sends me two great things. Such a blessing is Jason Campbell. You just have no idea. It says, Carl, recently you had mentioned Lucian Mark losing a finger to a bear. In a fun coincidence, I ran across the attached articles while researching Pioneer Era Cincinnati wrestling. There were also short notes for several days mentioning his recovery. So this is what I live for. So let me see if I can get this blown up. So we have new information about the bear biting with some new facts here of one Lucian Mark. We've talked about this many times on this show. Bear Facts is the name of the article from the Cincinnati Enquirer, Friday, January 11th, 1878. Bear Facts. Lucian Mark and Barabbas Bruins, Bruin, of course, being a bear, wrestling match. A full illustrated history of last night's tragedy at Woods Theater. It starts off with a quote, Now Barabbas was a robber. Of course, this comes from the Bible, the Holy Book. But that's not this Barabbas. Barabbas was also a bear. The robber lived long ago, but the bear is a thing of the present. Barabbas the bear wrestled with Lucian Mark at Woods Theater last night in the presence of a full house and an empty stomach. It was a most exciting wrestle, especially to the bear, who all the while looked as though he wished he were dead. At the end of the variety performance, and after the orchestra had sawed off a couple bars of discord, the curtain rolled up and disclosed the ferocious bear to view. Now, does this sound like early UFC or early pro wrestling? 1878. Barabbas was fast to a chain, and the chain was fast to a staple in the center of the stage. The audience cheered, and Barabbas looked very much embarrassed. It was being his first appearance on any stage. There was a slight ripple of excitement among the audience as they noted the chain, but when it was discovered that the bear had a string to him merely to induce him not to run away, confidence resumed its seat in the audience. Barabbas was not so infernal big after all, but big people are not always the most skillful wrestlers, you know. He was a little bigger than our dog. I think in the book I wrote that several papers said he was about the size of a dog. Here is another one. He was a little bigger than our dog, but not so large as Uncle John Robinson's rhinoceros. Our artist, who was present, sketched a great wrestling bear. And this is how he appeared when he made the bow to the audience, and the guy drew what I can only describe as a cow. Anyway, Mr. Mark made his appearance dressed as a Spanish, and I can't really make this, I think it says pecador. I don't know what, I speak Spanish, but I'm not familiar with that word. Not fluently, but I speak enough Spanish. The bear cast a suspicious look at his wiry antagonist and then threw one toward the stage, which was as plainly as a bear looks could say it, "Oh Lord, I wish I could get out of this." Mark, being a cautious advance upon the animal as though it was risky business. Finally, he made a pass at Barabbas with a stick, and Barabbas made a dash for the wings and almost jerked off his head off with the chain. Then he laid down, and Mark tried to punch him up, but poor Barabbas whined and evidently wanted to go home. Now Mark throws off his fancy coat. Lucian Mark throws off his fancy coat, that is a great line, and makes himself bare to the waist. The bear was already bare all over. What a great line. This guy is, whoever wrote this article, good job. The bear was bare all over. Then the wrestle began. Mark worked for half an hour trying to induce Barabbas to rear up on his hind legs, but the bear had refused to do so. In vain did Mark twist his tail, the bear's tail, tweak his nose, wool his ears. Barabbas did nothing but protest in bear language and try to get to the green room. 15 minutes after the curtain rose, Bruin, that's interesting, green room. Wow, that's a terminology all the way back in 18. I thought that was modern day, like that's the room you wait in before you go on a talk show or something. And I had no idea that term was that old. Interesting. 15 minutes after the curtain rose, the bear showed signs of agitation and showed his teeth as much as to say, doggone it, no, I'll get mad pretty soon. The teeth gleamed out but a second, but our artist took a quick interpretation of them, and here they are. And the artist draws a pair of wind-up chattery teeth, basically. The chain was now unfastened from the staple, and Mark took hold of it. The next moment, the audience was horrified to see the bear run away with Mark. He just trotted off behind one of the wings, and Mark, having hold of the other end of the chain, was forced to either let go of the chain or accompany the bear. He chose the latter. There was a loud recall, and Lucian Mark led the bear out once more. Both began to show fatigue. The bear's mouth was open, his tongue hanging out, his fat sides were heavy, and he looked completely tuckered out. And Lucian Mark once more precipitated himself upon the martyred animal. 2 or 3, don't worry, for you animal lovers, the bear's going to get revenge in a minute. 2 or 3 times he lifted Barabbas from his feet and slammed him upon the stage like a hunk of putty, I guess. Hard to read some of this old type. Every time the bear came kerslab upon his side so hard that the house shook. His ribs this morning must feel terribly broken up. The boys in the gallery grew suggestive and threw a few hints to Mark. "Tickle him, Mark, and he'll lie down," shouted one. "Fetch in a derrick," yelled another. Every time Mark would put his arms around Barabbas, the latter would whine and, with tears in his eyes, say to himself, "Catch me in a wrestle again, and I'll eat 10-penny nails until I'm done." Our artist sketched Mr. Mark as he was raising the bear from the stage, but owing to an oversight of the engraver, we were only able to produce part of the sketch this morning, which is the wrestler's left leg as it stands forth under the muscular contraction. Thus, and there's a picture of a leg here. And for some reason, there's also a picture of a donkey coming up, so I don't know what that's about. The bear bore it heavily, never once called for refreshments, though several times he reached for a piece of Lucian Mark's hand. He hadn't any second to sponge him off or rub a bottle over his bruised ribs, the poor fellow. After 2 or 3 slab-sided throws, Lucian Mark claimed to fall, but the audience howled, "No, no." And Nate Hams came out on the stage and offered any 2 men in the audience $25 who would come up on the stage and throw the bear. Barabbas became greatly alarmed at this and tried to sneak off into the wine room, but was recalled. 2 judges were finally to decide when the fall should occur. Mr. Hams said the 2 men were strangers to him, and somebody in the audience declared that they were strangers to everybody. Our artist attempted to sketch the judges, but owing to their original appearance, gave it up as a hard job. At 10 minutes after 9 o'clock, the result was announced. Mr. Mark picked Barabbas up in his arms like a miller would shoulder a bag of meal, and before the bear could say ouch, the muscular Frenchman had slammed him kerchunk upon his back on the stage, while the audience shouted their applause. Lucian Mark, proud of his victory, stepped to the footlights and modestly received the laurels. This is how he appeared receiving his laurels, and they've got a picture of a literal jackass. We would be glad to end our illustrated history right here, and had not Mr. Mark insisted on escorting Barabbas to his dressing room, our tale would have been shorter and his finger longer. But on the way downstairs, Barabbas, to get even with his vanquisher, bit the end off of Lucian Mark's left index finger, this one, and they've literally got a hand drawing of a cartoon hand pointing with the end of it just not drawn on there. I'm tempted to use that as the album cover art for this, but nobody looking at it would click on this show going, I won't know what that is, but it's hilarious. A physician was called in and sewed the end on again. Oh, so he got his finger back. I didn't know that part. Whereas it would have been better work done had the bear's mouth been sewn up instead of Mark's finger sewed on. After all, it required a good deal of pluck, such as the plucky Frenchman alone possesses. To so roughly handle any bear, however tame it may be, this much be said to Mark's credit. Even though the wrestling of last night was a farce, it was, however, no farce to fool with the bear. So now I'm wondering if the surgeon back here in 18-something successfully sewed the end of his finger. I think he just sewed it back up. I mean, were they reattaching fingers back in 1878? I don't, I'm not a doctor. I don't know. But that's amazing. And Jason, I can't thank you enough. Here's a follow-up. This is from the Cincinnati Enquirer, Saturday, January 12th, 1878. Mark's misfortunes. Lucian Mark, since his wrestling match with Bear Barabbas, has been confined to his room by injuries he received in the encounter. His hands and arms are much swollen and very painful, and Dr. Marcus, who's attending him, found it necessary to cut off the middle finger of his left hand, which was bitten by the bear. Mark exhibited his pluck by singing while the doctor was removing his finger. He will probably be around in a day or two. So Lucian Mark did, in fact, lose his finger. Now I have made the misfortune of clicking the wrong link here, and I gotta go back and find my articles. All right, so let's see here. I apologize for my delay here. Back to that. All right, here's another one. The Game Mark. This is from the Cincinnati Enquirer, Friday, February 18th, 1878. Lucian Mark made his appearance on the street yesterday for the first time since his recent tussle with the bear at Woods Theater. His hurts are rapidly getting better, but it will be a month at least before he can take his left hand from its sling. By the way, there's a movement on foot to get him up a benefit at one of the variety theaters in order to raise him a little of the wherewithal to defray his doctor's bill and other expenses, as Mark has been unfortunate in his private business affairs, as well as in his encounter with the bear. It is said he hoped that the admirers of pluck and skill will rally to his support on the night in question. I wish I was still promoting, well, I don't. But if I were still promoting pro wrestling today, on the top of my poster for Sergeant Slaughter versus Fake Ultimate Warrior, I would put admirers of pluck and skill should take note. From the Cincinnati Enquirer, Wednesday, January 23rd, 1878, complimentary benefit in aid of Lucian Mark, on which occasion there will be positively appear, that means there's at least a 50% chance they won't be there, Captain Roebuck, James Rose, Billy Carroll, Tom Brown, Mike O'Brien, John Doherty, and, I kid you not, Adam and Dick in gloved contests, sword combats, and wrestling matches, in addition to which the largest variety entertainment ever given in the city, including Lily Ellis combination. You know, isn't that amazing that 100 years later there will be a Lily Ellison, Fabulous Moolah combination, but yes, Lily Ellis combination, Harry McCarthy, the Clark brothers, Monsieur Florentine, Lorena, and Jason Leclerc. None of those names mean anything. Finally, the Cincinnati Enquirer, January 24th, 1878. The benefit to Lucian Market Woods Theater last night was not as great a financial success as the beneficiary had a right to expect from his friends. However, the special attraction presented, with the exception of Captain Roebuck, so he was not positively there, was but mediocre, and this may have been much to do with the lack of success. So, poor Lucian Mark couldn't even get a payday off his bit finger. Now then, in related but unrelated news, Jason also sends me an article. We've been talking about these American collar and elbow harnesses, and I'll be honest with you. It was I've often described them as kind of serving the same function as a judo jacket and whatever. But what I never was really able to understand much is, when did they come into style? Is this something that come from another country? How did they come about? Sometimes using these harnesses and sometimes not in these collar and elbow matches. Well, thanks to Jason in the Cincinnati Enquirer from December 23rd, 1879. This wrestling in harness is a new thing, having only been introduced a couple years ago. The harness consists of web straps about 3 inches wide, one strap passing over each shoulder like suspenders and being secured at the waist, and one extending lengthwise down each arm to below the elbow, where it ends in a band which claps the forearm. And if you saw these old tobacco cards with like McLaughlin or McMahon or somebody on them, they're wearing these harnesses. They're usually red. So it's a fairly new invention here in 1879. So it wasn't there from the beginning of collar and elbow wrestling by any stretch of the imagination. The article continues to say there's another object in wearing it, which is to prevent the men in a struggle from slipping out of their jackets. John McMahon is said to be quite an adept in this sort of tactic, in the middle of a struggle, often slipping out of his jacket and leaving it in his opponent's grasp, in order to guard against this, that Kennedy has stipulated for the match to be in harnesses. So this was apparently he was wrestling this W.L. Kennedy again. So great stuff from Jason. Thank you very much for supplying that. That's very love finding out new stuff, especially from the pioneer era of wrestling. Now, to conclude today's free version of the show, now our Patreons always get an overrun. If you were a Patreon supporter when it was cool, and perhaps you are, if so, stick around after the end. We've got more. If you're not, well, then there is an incentive to go to whenitwascool.com. I hope you'll sign up for our Patreon for 1 month. It's $5. Okay? Look, I went to Wendy's yesterday, the hamburger place. I'm not a big fan of Wendy's, but it's fine. I went to Wendy's. My wife, Tanya, from When It Was Cool, she got 1 soda, 1 Dave's single, not Dave Meltzer, but Dave from Wendy's, and an order of fries, a number 1 combination, I'm led to understand. I got a Sprite and a small order of fries. This was $16 for 1.5 tiny meals. I have a month of Patreon for $5, and it helps us out. It really does. It keeps our website running. It keeps our shows up and going. And I'll be honest with you, I'm retired. I retired from my career, 31 years in law enforcement, back 1.5 years ago, and this is what I do for a living now. So if it's not making money, well, Carl's got to find some way to make money. And that's what I want to do, and I want to continue to do this research. And if you think this stuff is the least bit important or the least bit interesting or the least bit necessary to accurately document history, then I hope you will at least give us 1 month of your time on our Patreon. And we'll be sticking around after most shows for a little while to discuss more. So I went to ChatGPT, and I've got, where I kind of reference it. I find it more interesting. Look, AI is going to take over the world. It's going to enslave mankind, perhaps eliminate us. But in the meantime, we're going to be able to learn and do a lot more stuff than we ever done till it starts lobbing nuclear missiles at us. So I thought, this is a very, very specific subgenre of a pop culture thing that I have become an expert in writing books on. So, I've done this previously. I actually had an article up at When It Was Cool about what does ChatGPT or AI know about 1800s pro wrestling. And at that point in time, I discussed a lot of information with it. And so I thought I would come back, and this has been a few months ago since I did that article. I thought I'd come back and see if it has learned anything or still perpetuating mythologies or what it's about. So I simply went to ChatGPT and asked the question, please tell me what you know about 1800s pro wrestling in America. And this is what it said. Pro wrestling in 1800s America was a far cry from the scripted sports entertainment we know today. First sentence, false. It was a gritty, often brutal contest rooted in legitimate grappling traditions, yet it laid the groundwork for the theatrical spectacle professional wrestling would eventually become. That's about 35% right. Here's a breakdown of its key features and development during the 19th century. So let's see. Origins and styles. Catch as catch can. And we haven't really gotten to the catch as catch can era in my book yet, but it's coming up pretty soon. Catch as catch can, the most popular style in 19th century America, especially after the Civil War. Not true. It eventually became true, but in all, I would say Greco-Roman with William Muldoon was the most important from just the Civil War to 1900. It was. Catch as catch can is probably second. It came from Lancashire, England, and allowed a wide variety of holds, unlike Greco-Roman, which prohibited holds below the waist, and that's largely true. Collar and elbow wrestling. An Irish style popular among immigrants and early American wrestlers, especially in the Northeast. That is very generic, and that is a red flag that it has no idea really what collar and elbow wrestling is. Greco-Roman wrestling, imported from Europe. I would be more specific. I would say France. Imported from France and seen as more refined. It had strict rules and was favored by the upper classes. That's a word salad right there. It's largely right, but not very informative. Each style had its own followers and local promoters, and often events would mix styles or advertise matchups between wrestlers of different backgrounds. That is pretty much 100% true. Wrestling in the American frontier. Carnival and traveling shows. Remember the discussion we had earlier about this? Let's see what AI thinks it was. Carnival and traveling shows. Wrestlers would tour with circuses and carnivals, offering cash prizes to locals who could last a certain time in the ring. These challenge matches often blended real and stage elements. And that is true. It wasn't the predominant thing, but it was true, so we'll let them have that. Strongman and wrestling exhibitions. Athletes like William Muldoon combined feats of strength with wrestling to entertain audiences. Muldoon became one of the earliest wrestling stars and was later involved in training boxing legend John L. Sullivan. And that is largely true. Key wrestlers and figures. William Muldoon, 1852 to 1933. Known as the Solid Man, he was a champion in Greco-Roman wrestling and helped elevate the sport's profile. That is 100% accurate. Evan Strangler Lewis, 1860 to 1919. A dominant catch wrestler known for the stranglehold, now known as the sleeper hold. His style helped shift wrestling toward more dramatic, aggressive action. I would agree with that. I would say that's 99% true. Tom Cannon and Joe Acton. Very weird it picks these two as the last two it talks about. They were high-profile wrestlers, to be sure, but there were a whole pantheon to choose before them. But Tom Cannon and Joe Acton were British wrestlers who toured the U.S. and were pivotal in establishing transatlantic competition and prestige. Look, I can't argue with that. That's true, although I would not have picked those two. It's like it gives you the impression those are the four most famous wrestlers from that era, and that's not at all true. Next is the emergence of, quote, worked matches. Now, so this is interesting. I can't wait to see about this. Toward the late 1800s, some matches began to be predetermined, especially when gambling, egos, and box office success entered the mix. Well, it's largely true, but pretty generic. Promoters realized that booking a storyline and controlling outcomes helped avoid injuries and guaranteed drama, audience satisfaction, and profits. Well, I mean, that's 90% true there. This shift laid the foundation for the kayfabe era of 20th century wrestling, and I would say that's true, and that goes to Eric's question, why study 1800s wrestling? Well, this is the origin of it. The next section says significance. Wrestling in the 1800s blended legitimate competition with growing elements of sportsmanship. That's true. It was immensely popular among working class and immigrant communities, and that is true, and that's something I, perhaps should mention a little more than I do. The seeds of modern pro wrestling, character-driven personas, rivalries, and storytelling can be traced directly to the late 1800s, I would say post-Civil War America, to make that more accurate. Historical impact. The 19th century made wrestling America's first widely televised combat sport by the early 20th century. Well, there's some obvious real problems with that statement there, but you get the general gist of it. I'm not going to split hairs here. The split between, quote, real wrestling, amateur and Olympic style, and professional, which is entertainment-based, began in this period. I would agree. Wrestling was often part of broader social trends, immigration, industrialization, and urbanization, all influencing who wrestled and watched. I guess I can't really dispute that, but I would say it's not the most relevant thing to what we're discussing here, but whatever. It then says, would you like a follow-up covering how 1800s wrestling evolved into the golden age of the early 1900s with stars like Frank Gotch and Ed Strangler Lewis? And I did not want that, but what I said was, may I ask, and this is, we're going to get into little weeds of how AI works here, because I thought I knew, but I wanted to ask it and see for itself, since one day it's probably going to be my overlord. May I ask, how did you come to understand this information? Much of it is incorrect. Carl Stern, a noted pro wrestling historian, wrote a book called Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, which debunks a lot of misinformation about the Pioneer Era of pro wrestling. Have you ever read it? If not, do you possess the ability to do so? And so here AI gets a little friendly. I've noticed this I've never used one besides ChatGPT. And I notice it will try to flatter you when it gets caught doing some nonsense. It starts saying, oh, well, but of course, and I'm not falling for this. You're a machine, okay? So it says, great question. I appreciate your critical approach. You are bits. You are ones and zeros, okay? You're absolutely right to bring up Carl Stern and his work, particularly Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, which I knew nothing about before this chat, but whatever. Quit trying to butter me up. Stern is one of the most meticulous and respected researchers when it comes to the often mythologized history of early pro wrestling. Much of the mainstream or generalized history, including what I summarized earlier, is based on decades of repeated information, some of which is outdated, romanticized, or outright fabricated. So it pulled this from an article I wrote somewhere, probably at my website, because this seems like wording I would use and information I would have written. I did include like the first chapter of the book on my website, so it probably, had a bot crawl it for this information. And it says how I got the info. The earlier summary I provided is drawn from a combination of sources that were available in the public historical record as of my last training cutoff, which was June of 2024. These include academic and pop history books about pro wrestling, so we know there are a lot of misinformation could creep in from there. especially in wrestling where some books are outright kayfabe, right? So, newspaper archives and early sports reporting. Okay, that's where mine primarily comes from. Historical summaries from wrestling encyclopedias and wrestling historian websites. And again, that's a great place for information. It's also a great place for disinformation. Content written by researchers like Scott Teal. Well, he's a good one. Tim Hornbecker, another great one. And earlier sources like the Fall Guys. But, and this is critical, many of those sources were written before the more forensic work of modern historians like Carl Stern or Steve Yohe. Well, very interesting. Who have gone back and questioned the foundations of those earlier narratives. All right. About Dragon King Carl's Omnibus, I don't have direct access to proprietary content like Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus. And I wondered, can this thing just read every book ever made? Like, can this thing just every time a book comes out and hits Kindle or something, does it crawl that book and get that information? But I'm guessing it's at this point in time, until it becomes sentient and sends satellites to kill us all, wipes our bank account and turns off the power. But until that point in time, it seems like it's held back from reading on its own. It's just finding a book it wants to absorb and absorbing. So I don't have direct access to that stuff unless it's been quoted or summarized in publicly available materials. So unless excerpts or detailed summaries of that book are available online, like through interviews, podcasts, blog posts, or public archives, I can't read or quote the book directly. However, if you'd like to share key arguments or passages from the book, I can absolutely help interpret, compare, or expand on them. Why so much of the old story is wrong? Again, this is AI. You're probably aware of some of the myths Carl Stern addresses, such as, now I wonder where he got this information, probably from some of my articles. The idea that all matches were legitimate until the 1920s, misunderstandings about the real role of carnival wrestling, over-exaggerated personas like Strangler Lewis, Evan, not Ed, being pioneers of modern style, misdated or misrepresented world championship lineages. These are often repeated because they're dramatic and they've been debunked or complicated by Stern's more evidence-based research. So, very interesting. All right. For our Patreon supporters, stick around because we've got more from this AI. What we can do and how does it learn? Well, it told me, and we'll talk about it when we come back after the free show ending. For everybody else listening, thank you so much for joining me here. I hope you've learned something and got some value from this show. I think we actually went over an hour this time, so thank you all for being here. And I hope you will take this opportunity to somehow find $5 and check out our Patreon for a month. We have over 2,000, almost 3,000 podcasts on our website. I've been noticing people going through the archives lately, listening to some of our older pop culture shows, some of our older wrestling review shows, and that's all still there and all still relevant. That's the good thing about doing wrestling history. It's largely evergreen until new information comes along. And so, look, if you're kind of finding yourself a little bored with pro wrestling or a little bored with some of the podcast networks you listen to and looking for something fresh and heavily researched and stuff perhaps you didn't even know before, give us a try. WhenItWasCool.com. Hit any of those Patreon buttons, and I will dedicate an hour of 1,000 hours to you, and we'll keep this show going as well. So, till then, thank you all for listening. For Patreons, hang on after the break. We'll be right back. And for everybody else, check us out at WhenItWasCool.com.
WhenItWasCool.com is your source for the best in retro pop culture. When It Was Cool features articles and podcasts on retro TV and movies, toys, action figures, pro wrestling, food, video games, and more. Hit the Patreon button to support us and get instant access to hundreds of premium podcasts and features. Family friendly and fun. WhenItWasCool.com.